Welcome back to this week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and you can read more about us online at tertiumquids.org. Our first guest this week has got a very bold plan, and I wish more people in Washington were heeding her call for the replacement of Obamacare. I have my own personal opinion as to why they're recalcitrant, but she is the great Grace Marie Turner, president of the Galen Institute. Grace Marie, welcome back to the program. How are you?
Fine. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, no. Please, you're one of those guests we could probably have on every week, although I guess I would have hoped by now the need to be discussing the replacement of Obamacare would have become a history lesson, like how do we learn from what we had to go through, and not something where we're still a moving target on this. What has happened in Washington since the beginnings of Obamacare? It seemed like once there was a pen in the White House ready to sign the repeal of Obamacare, it would have been easy peasy lemon squeezy, but we've had a bumpier ride than we expected.
Well, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there was such an imperative to repeal Obamacare, but not as much unity in what replace meant. And that's something that we can talk about because I think we now do have a plan that could get us to replace in something that would be a much more free market, freedom and prosperity oriented plan. But also the Congressional Budget Office, which has way too much power in dictating the shape of legislation, kept saying that 20 to 25 million people were going to lose their coverage if any of the Republican plans passed. And that didn't matter whether or not people were going to still get the same subsidies, however much the legislation was going to continue to support people who need coverage in lower income categories, because all of the bills that were considered last year would have repealed the individual mandate. They thought that people were just going to leave the market in droves, and 22 million people would lose their health insurance coverage. That was just too hard for a few recalcitrant senators and members of Congress to be able to swallow. So the legislation did not pass. But since then, as we know, Congress has repealed the individual mandate as part of the tax bill. And so the Congressional Budget Office is now having to redo its budget estimates, assuming with that assumption gone that the individual mandate was going to somehow magically get us to full coverage. So now we're going to be able to have a more realistic estimate from CBO of what the coverage impact would be of this new plan. And in fact, we think more people will actually get covered as a result of this plan because primarily health costs would go down. That's the main reason that people are being driven out of the market. They cannot afford the Obamacare coverage. They want more choices, and that's what we would provide them.
We've watched an interesting movement here, and I want to get into the piece you wrote on helping the states help the poor, because I really think that is where so much of the pushback on repeal of Obamacare has been politicians who are listening or talking with their campaign consultants saying, oh, you don't want to be the guy that has to answer for all these rhetorical statements that a real or imagined opponent might throw at you regarding the poor and health care rather than health insurance, which is a conversation you and I have had since, I think, 2009, Grace Marie, that this has always been about health insurance, not about health care. And it's a shame, but I guess that's the price we pay for a democratically elected representative body, isn't it?
Well, it is, and actually I think with Medicaid in particular, what's happened is that the states, in California I think is the worst offender here, have spent so much time and energy trying to enroll these newly eligible recipients, able-bodied, healthy single adults, childless single adults, into Medicaid, that the people who were on Medicaid, who have nowhere else to go for coverage, are getting it's even more difficult for them to be able to get the care that they need. And many states have waiting lists for people to get Medicaid services who really need them because they're spending so much time going out to enroll these newly eligible Medicaid recipients. We've got to rebalance that so that Medicaid is there to serve the most vulnerable, the people who do not have anywhere else to go for coverage, unlike most of the newly eligible Medicaid expansion population. At least half of them have other options for coverage, but they don't take them because Medicaid's basically free, so they do that instead. And it's crowding out the people who most need this program, and states have to have a new incentive to fix that, and that's what our plan would do.
I love the way you put that because it's so clear. And here in Virginia, we've actually heard ads run by organizations of hospitals thanking senators and delegates for standing up to expand Medicaid, even in the face of the fact that the Office of Management and Budget has said, we're not going to send you the money we originally said we were going to under the Obama administration, so don't bank on that. So you start to see it for what it is. It's more about the insurance companies and the hospital companies than it is about the patients. And the Medicaid expansion here in Virginia especially was more about bringing not just the poor, Grace Marie, as you mentioned in California. We're talking about middle-class people who are working in jobs and are working for companies and bringing them into Medicare roles. That seems like the opposite of what we should be doing.
That's exactly. And the federal government when this program started, was paying 100% of the cost of Medicaid expansion for able-bodied, healthy, childless adults. And in states, affluent states like Virginia, they only pay 50 to 60% for much more vulnerable people who have many more health problems and who have nowhere else to go for coverage other than Medicaid. It's crazy. It's upside down, and there's no way, to your point, Joe, that the federal government can continue to make those huge payments for these able-bodied adults. What we're saying is give them an opportunity to get a subsidy to purchase private coverage. Many of them have an offer of job-based coverage, but they don't accept it because it costs them some money. Well, allow that subsidy to go toward the purchase of private coverage, which is where they should be anyway, not competing for the few providers who are able to see Medicaid patients and make it more difficult for them to get the care they need.
Well, Grace Marie, let me ask you this, because I think President Trump, tweets, whatever style points notwithstanding, is the first president in some time that I've heard actually speak towards having less poor people and working towards an economy where there are fewer people that need Medicare or any other sort of poverty aid programs. Why is it it's taken so long for Republicans and Democrats to actually say, did they truly believe that the new normal, as President Obama referred to it, was taking effect and that we were going to have to manage the decline? And if so, is President Trump just blowing smoke up our skirt? And are we really going to be able to see a place where we have fewer people in need of these social programs?
Well, and I think that's really the goal, is to get people into a situation where they have an opportunity to work and have an opportunity to have the dignity of bringing a paycheck home and supporting their families rather than being on the dole. And I do think that it's a different mentality, and you've got to have a more robust economy, but you also have to reform these social welfare programs in a way that allows them to take care of the people that they're designed for and not put so many people on these programs that you wind up with sort of the European welfare dependency class where I had a taxi driver one time in Stockholm who said, I don't really need to work. The government pays for my housing and feeds my kids at school, and it provides all my health care. I just like to take a vacation every once in a while, and I need to work in order to be able to do that. We don't want to get to a point where the economy is so stultified because people are waiting for their next government check, but instead of really getting out there and finding out what is their God-given gift to be able to contribute to society. And that's one of the provisions in the welfare to work, to allow people, if you're on Medicaid and you're able to work, go out there and try to get a job or volunteer or provide child care. Do something to make yourself useful and to earn this benefit.
Now, you brought up the idea that you've got generations of people who've just accepted the government payment for existence, and it seems dispiriting to think. So when we look at the Medicaid proposal in Virginia, it was tied to and may often fail because Governor Northam said he wouldn't sign the bill as the General Assembly proposed it because it involves so much welfare to work type provisos that you would have to get involved in. It still seems to dodge the idea of how do we start creating a better environment for these folks to find those career ladder positions and to find those ways to feed their families. Is it possible that politicians just can't think that far out of the box, that they only think in terms of I've taken in this much tax revenue, here's how I'm going to give it out, and they can't be creative enough to start talking about ways to make an environment where there are fewer people in need?
Well, and I think that's really one of the things that President Trump's doing. He's shaking up the system and saying we're not going to do politics as usual here. He's doing some things that seem pretty bold and risky with all the trade provisions, for example. But he believes we really need to break things open. We saw it happen in the 1990s when Congress passed the welfare reform measures. People were saying, "Oh my goodness, that the whole system is going to collapse. People are going to be starving and on the streets." And what we found was that people found jobs and they found dignity and they were able to support their families and they taught their kids work ethics, and it was a huge success. And we've backslid. A lot of those provisions were undone during the Obama administration, but we've got to move back. We cannot have a society that functions when everybody is a burden. We've got to have more people carrying the burden for those who can't take care of themselves, and not expecting somebody to take care of them even though they have the capacity to take care of themselves. And I think that's really the philosophy. And there are politicians. There are politicians at both the federal and the state level who think that's the right thing to do because it's the right thing for America. It's our value as a country to have freedom and independence. You don't have freedom if you are dependent upon the federal dole. We want freedom and independence and prosperity and dignity, and much of dignity can come from work and being able to find what it is that you can do that is uniquely valuable to society. It's there, but if people don't have an incentive to go out and search for that, they're not going to do it, and they're really oppressed by these government programs.
Well, and even beyond that, Grace Marie Turner is on with us, and we'll circle back to this in a moment to take a break. But the Galen Institute, galen.org, is great, ideas towards better moving forward, is the disincentive that Obamacare created with some of its requirements that were actually forcing full-time employees into part-time employees here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Grace Marie Turner of the Galen Institute is on with us this week, and when we went to break, we were talking about the disincentives, that the attempt to help. And I remember speaking with you years ago on this, Grace Marie, and you've appeared in our flagship city in Charlottesville and held some great events regarding the reality of healthcare reform. And perhaps it's a life lesson for a lot of the grassroots that things take a long time to undo. Was that Obamacare created this whether intended or unintended consequence of many people losing their full-time jobs and being pushed into part-time work because it kept their companies from having to trigger I think it was 30 hours a week. Then they would have to provide very expensive, what had become, because it was subsidized, very expensive health insurance. Are we seeing that reversing? And if not, how soon can we start to see that start to reverse?
That's such an important point. So even though the Congress has been able to repeal the individual mandate, the mandate that individuals have to have health insurance coverage and it's repealed starting next year, the employer mandate is still in place, that employers have to provide coverage for their employees if they meet this long list of criteria if they work more than 30 hours a week. So 30 hours a week is considered a full-time job, and what employers did was say, we can't afford to pay a minimum wage person and still buy them a $22,000 health insurance policy that basically doubles their wage. We can't afford that. And so the companies were cutting hours back, and it was particularly difficult for young people trying to get their foot on the ladder, that first job out of school, to get that first job so they could begin to make a place for themselves in the private economy. And those jobs just have dried up. So one of the next things we need to do is get rid of that employer mandate, because it is suppressing the ability of people, particularly the most vulnerable, the people trying hardest to get that job, who cannot find those jobs because employers can't afford to provide this expensive health care coverage that they otherwise would be required to provide. So yes, that's a big weight on the economy, and Congress needs to act on that.
Is there anything already circulating through the committees? We watch with some great zeal. Several of our friends are cast members, I guess, if you want to use that phrase, in this documentary called The Swamp that a filmmaker has made regarding how Congress has grown so incapable of getting out of its own way under the weight of its committees. Revelations like committee assignments and committee chairs for sale from both political parties. So it becomes less surprising that both political parties tend to seem to govern the same way. Those sorts of things. Are there bills going through the House or even proposed in the House that would do that, Grace Marie?
Well, I focus primarily on health policy issues, and what I see is really a fresh approach to be able to do something that's more targeted, that has bipartisan support. Senator Rick Santorum, former Pennsylvania senator, is really a leader in this effort. We're working with the Heritage Foundation, with the Americans for American Action Forum, with the Galen Institute, obviously, to try to come up with a bottom-up approach. This is a bill that is being developed on the outside by policy experts, many of whom used to work in government and know what needs to be done, to then say to Congress, this is the bill we want on health reform. This is a bill that would move power and control away from Washington back to the states over making decisions about how the Obamacare money is spent. That's the way to do this, is to have outside pressure building with coalitions around the country. We had a conference call a couple of weeks ago. 800 people, leaders of groups from around the country, were on this call. They want action on Obamacare, but they want it to be on their terms, not the terms that Washington is writing. So I think this is really a new model, Joe, of how to get the Congress to act, because the people are demanding action, and this is action that moves power and control away from Washington back to the states and ultimately to the individual. That's really the key, is getting Washington to not have such a lock on all the spending that allows it to write all the rules for how every program has to work, and even many parts of the private sector economy. Getting the money and power out of Washington to the states and back to individuals is the key to all of this.
This almost plays out like that nightmare scenario in that classic American fight between Patrick Henry and James Madison over the the proposed Constitution of our government, in which Patrick Henry was fighting against it, saying this is centralized government and this is what we just threw off. And Madison, I think to his credit, put a lot of blocks and a lot of checks and balances in there. But boy, we are a creative bunch, aren't we, Grace Marie? We have written some ways around it, haven't we?
Well, and it's the deficit spending, since states states have to balance their budgets, and the federal government doesn't, and therefore it just does not have the checks and balances that states and that virtually all the rest of us in our own private household budgets have to have. You've got to be able to match your spending to your income, and the federal government doesn't do that, and that's one of the reasons so many people call for a balanced budget amendment. Yep. If the federal government had to really get down to the business of deciding what spending is important,
oh boy,
then I think we would have a very different conversation.
Well, it's like you read my notes through the phone there, Grace Marie. I wanted to ask you about Bob Goodlatte's HB1 that for probably as long as you and I have known each other, he always brings HB1, which is his balanced budget amendment. I find it to be one of the most nuanced because it ties the balancing of the budget to GDP, so there's no hard ceiling per se, but it does require that we make our books balance. If we're earning this much tax revenue, we can only spend this much. Those kind of things. Is that an important part of this, that if that could pass, that will force sort of the hand on finding the fix for Obamacare or the national health care zeal that we seem to have?
It would fix a lot of things, but I think we need to have a national conversation over that, and we're not there yet. I think we have to get this economy on a more solid structure so that all those people who are currently dependent on all these government programs don't need them as much. Mm-hmm. And then we can begin the process of returning power and control ultimately to individuals through their states, and the federalist approach that the founders really envisioned. They never envisioned, in fact, they were frightened of having a massive federal government. Yeah. And we are too. But we've got to get this economy back in shape so that people don't need these handouts, so that we can then move toward this approach that I think would really get us on a long-term, more sound footing.
Well, I know that when I lived in Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum was my senator for quite a bit of time, and we were always very impressed with the, for the caricature the press would make of him or his opponents would make of him. He was one of the more level-headed and thoughtful legislators when it came to writing legislation that had not just teeth, but also had the ability to be good for all.
I'm telling you, he has been at these weekly meetings for months, hammering out the details of his policy proposal with us. And he is absolutely invaluable because he brings not only his deep policy understanding expertise, which frankly not a lot of members have, but also he talks about it from the perspective of what's doable politically. And so you really are able to have a policy proposal that's good and well thought through, but that's also politically realistic. Yep. Too many people in the policy community say, oh, this is what we should do, and politicians look at them and say, there's no way it could pass that. So what you need is to have those two things interwoven at the beginning, and he's just been an absolutely invaluable member of our team, and he continues to talk regularly with his former colleagues in the Senate so that they are informed about what's going on as well. So he says this is the first time he's seen in his 25 years of public service a process that is driven from the bottom, he says, from the bottom up and from the inside out by coalitions and policy experts who really get it about the need to repeal and replace Obamacare, but doing it in a way that's sensible and that's also realistic to make sure people aren't harmed, but that we move to a better system in the future. And he's just been terrific to work with.
And you give me such great hope. The Galen Institute has always been a great place to go to for health policy in the first place, but incorporating Rick's ability to write and pass legislation when he was in the Senate it gives me greater hope as well. It's galen.org, GALEN.org. Read all about it. Join in, help out, find out how you can be that grassroots on your end, perhaps pushing your congressperson from the inside out, as Grace Marie says. And Grace Marie, thank you so much for your visit. It's great to catch up with you, and please enjoy spring, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Thank you, Joe, very much. And onward we go.
Yes, we never thought we'd still be saying that, but you know what? The fact we're saying it all
we're going to get this right this time.
That's right. Coming up next, Brian McNicoll is going to join us from Town Hall Magazine, Town Hall columnist on the Amazon and U.S. Postal Service relationship, a reality tour of that, coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And one of those places where the marketplace has gotten a little muddied in Washington is the Internet. Over this past week, we've heard people start talking again about Internet sales tax, who's getting away with what, and are there unfair trade deals as far as the Internet goes, especially as it relates to Amazon and the U.S. Postal Service. Great column on it, and we're going to put it up on our social media platforms as well, so you can get it. It's at townhall.com, written by Brian McNicoll on the Amazon and U.S. Postal Service relationship. He even got the U.S. Postal Service to issue a statement in response to it. Brian, welcome to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Good to be here.
So, first and foremost, this is an agreement between the U.S. Postal Service and Amazon. This isn't something that Amazon found some exploit and is cheating the U.S. Postal Service out of something.
Well, no, the Postal Service agreed to it. One of the things about the Postal Service is they're very good at achieving efficiencies in the mailroom, but they're bad deal makers. And this was one of the worst deals they've ever made. It's just not something they have expertise in, and this was a bad thing.
So what
has happened is, as a result of this deal, the Postal Service has built all this infrastructure to handle it, like hiring temp employees. They run delivery and U.S. mail trucks on Sundays. Which is, if it's a regular employee, that's triple time that they earn.
Yeah, I always wondered about that.
And the Citigroup, which was studying it for investment purposes, calculated that the investment purposes in the competitors of Amazon, FedEx and UPS, found that it cost $3.46 per package for the post office to deliver for Amazon, but they only charge Amazon $2. So every time they do it, they lose $1.46.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. Almost half. With like 60%, it would need to go up just to break even.
Now, what would possibly have attracted this kind of deal to the U.S. Postal Service? Were they just not looking? Were they, I can't imagine somebody agreeing to especially the Sunday part of it. And we get Sunday packages all the time from our Amazon Prime account, and I've always puzzled at how you can do that without such a higher price, as you pointed out, triple time for employees on a Sunday.
Well, the post office, the volume of first-class mail, letters and so forth, is down to about 40% since 2001, as we've learned to use the Internet to pay bills and invite people to parties and so forth. There's not as many Christmas cards. There's a million things going on.
Sure.
So they had to make up volume. And the packages was now we order stuff. It's right up their alley, and we order stuff, but the post office does not figure the cost. For instance, according to the law, according to the thing they're governed by now, the post office is supposed to add 5.5% to its cost for the stuff it handles for Amazon, but it actually adds about 25% to the post office cost. So they're not collecting what they should from Amazon.
Did they not understand? Did they not understand what Amazon was asking for them, or was it a scale issue?
I think they were desperate to run up the volume. And,
Okay.
so being able to say, hey, we're selling, their package, their revenues are up, their number of pieces handled is up. From that standpoint, it looks like it's working. But, it's like, remember they used to have that Amtrak train that went from Chicago to Janesville, Wisconsin, and no one ever rode it. And they
Yes.
didn't want anybody to ride it because more people who rode it, the worse loss Amtrak took. This is like that. The more people who actually use this Amazon through the post office service, the bigger loser the post office is.
Yeah, it becomes this volume deal. That's crazy. Yeah. But, it sounds like the kind of deal that a bureaucracy would make there. Is there a fix to it? Is there a trigger that one party can renegotiate it, or are we stuck with it?
Well, I think that both Amazon and the Postal Service have realized that, the president's remarks on it and other scrutiny has gotten it to the point where they need to do something about it. And they have begun to talk about how to fix it. I don't know what will come of it. It's in the early stages yet. But I think you will see something that happens to where at least the post office is not losing money. And they're not only losing money off of this, but they're running up all these pension costs. And they don't pay their pension fund at all. They haven't put a penny in for pensions since 2011.
Well, and that's always been the bigger bugaboo about the U.S. Postal Service is this legacy that they wind up with. And if I remember correctly, their pension fund, their contract with their pension fund means that if they hire Brian McNicoll today, they have to set aside all the potential pension money he could possibly ever, get to long before you've even qualified to be in the pension fund. And that may be an oversimplification of it, but their pension contract is crippling.
Right. The Congress insisted the last time there was postal legislation, which was 2006, Congress said, you need to fix this. You need to fund your pension and retiree health benefits way out in advance. And it looks like a smart deal because, they haven't paid since 2011, and they're now like about $120 billion behind. And, the argument that you hear back about this is, well, the post office is not a federal government agency. They don't get money from the federal government. Somebody's going to pay that $120 billion.
Yeah.
And, I think I know who it's going to be.
Well, if we're going to bail out GM, we're certainly going to bail out the U.S. Postal Service. We're not going to sell it to the FedEx, folks.
Right. And even though the volume of the mail is down, we're more dependent on it than we've ever been for package delivery and so forth.
Would it be beneficial to let the U.S. Postal Service go under and see what comes out of the ashes of something like that, Brian?
Well, you have a lot of the country that wouldn't get served. The post office goes to 155 million homes, businesses a day. And nobody else has that delivery network. So actually the delivery network itself is of great value by itself. Plus they have a monopoly, on last mile delivery. That only the Postal Service could put something in your mailbox or through your mail slot by law. And they have a very marketable thing. And this is actually not a terrible way to market it. They've just let FESA price them to the point where they can't make money on it.
Brian McNicoll is on with us, townhall.com columnist, in which he takes, the Amazon U.S. Postal Service relationship to task. And I found this U.S. Postal Service issued a statement in which it says, while the Postal Service always welcomes constructive dialogue regarding its current fiscal challenges, commentary brimming with half-truths and inaccuracies is not helpful. Regrettably, Brian McNicoll's blog the other day falls into the latter category. And then it goes on to not actually name any of the half-truths or anything, just goes on into more platitudes about how great they're really doing and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Is that helpful for them to just sort of circle the wagons and not say, yeah, we got problems here?
Right. I think, the current Postmaster General, Megan Brennan, realizes that this is a problem. I mean, it's obviously, she's done a lot of work on improving the efficiency of mail handling facilities and so forth, and they've really made some pretty good progress there. But their problem is the previous Postmaster General, who was in office for like 30 years, whose name is Donahue, is came out the other day with a statement where he says, "Oh no, this is a totally profitable deal." It's not a profitable. If you're charging $2 or something that costs $3.46 to produce, it's not a profitable deal.
Now, isn't there? And this was in one of the newspapers around here. Was a response that said that there is actually a law that requires the Postal Service to, and I think you mentioned this in the earlier part of our interview. So did they violate this law by cutting a deal that actually undercuts the cost of doing business with Amazon?
I think that they can technically claim to have not violated the law because they used the 5.5% figure. But, considering that it's 25% of their costs, so what the post office does is they put everything down to institutional costs. So, the building is, the percentage of the building that they use that's devoted to dealing with Amazon is not figured in. It's just, those are institutional costs.
Right.
That's all pay that. Well, if you're adding on to your buildings to handle handle Amazon business, if you're adding trucks, if you're spending $200 million on scanners to, process Amazon orders, then, that's a lot more than 5.5%. And that's the problem, is they've spent all this money to comply with this contract that has made the contract unprofitable.
Is it possible for a FedEx or a U.S. or a United Parcel Service to even, fairly negotiate for a contract like this because of the size of the U.S. Postal Service?
Right. They're blocked out of this. They can do it. They have their own deals with the post office. Post office delivers some stuff to them too. Mm-hmm. But they're locked out of this deal, and they'll never get terms this good because this one won't be going on for much longer. People realize it's a bad deal. So they're right now. The Amazon is enjoying profits that UPS and FedEx will never see. Will never be able to get their hands on.
What about other online ordering businesses? I certainly there are the big box stores that have online, Target and that kind of thing. But Joe's Metal Shop here in Charlottesville that makes wrought iron products, and you can order them mail order. It's got to put them at an enormous competitive disadvantage. I'm sure they're paying bust out retail for postal delivery. Right.
That's exactly right. It's a terrible thing for Main Street America. All of Amazon is in a way, because you don't need to go to a store. They handle everything for you and so forth.
Somebody was
merchants, it's up to them to fix them. But the things that are unfair and you're taking a loss, you shouldn't also have to pay taxes for someone to be able to undercut you.
Is the accumulation of market share by Amazon putting it in a place where you hear the names like Standard Oil and Microsoft and those are certainly the two biggest antitrust cases out there. Is this the first real sort of online antitrust test coming up, Brian, from where you sit?
It could go there. I think if things like this start getting looked at, it won't, but it certainly could.
Is that perhaps a bargaining chip for the U.S. Postal Service or the Trump administration to get a better deal for the U.S. Postal Service by saying, listen, you guys are teetering on a place where, we might have to go Standard Oil on you, and you don't want that.
You can talk to our postal negotiators or antitrust prosecutors.
Well, the president. I've watched Donald Trump negotiate things you never thought you. I watched Ed Koch give him tax breaks, and it's the last thing.
We're going to talk to North Korea. Whoever thought that was possible?
Right. So getting somebody to the table is not his problem.
The story here in Washington is he's just mad at the Post, and I will say that of all the papers that attack him, the Post is the most vituperative of the major papers. Mm-hmm. They're liberal papers. They write, they don't like what he does. But the Post is just absolutely mean-spirited about it. So I understand why he's more angry with them than the others. And I think at this time it produced a good result.
Well, and certainly Bezos is, this guy who's starting to accumulate all these different things in his Whole Foods market, and you can order your groceries through Amazon. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a Prime account. What potentially could happen from in this deal, Brian? What does the Postal Service need out of Amazon, and what would it cost the average listener of this program? Does the Amazon pass that along to the consumer? Does all of a sudden everybody's Amazon subscriptions go up 5% or 10% to make up for this? What happens?
I think regular packages, loosely defined, my understanding is would go up about $1.50 a package to make it, if they rework the deal and make it where it makes money. Mm-hmm. But it's not just delivering packages. Like in San Francisco, the Postal Service goes to the fish markets on the dock, right, and delivers the fresh fish to restaurants in San Francisco on behalf of Amazon.
What?
So now the Postal Service is buying, fish handling trucks, right? That's not the business that we need them to be in.
Yeah, that's
kind of cast afar.
Now, is that just an interpretation? Did they not realize Amazon was going to get into this kind of stuff when they signed this deal, or did Amazon kind of slip them a Mickey in all the branches?
I think they knew it and they were excited about it and thought they could make money off of it. Thought, heck, we can deliver anything, right, to anybody quickly and efficiently, which is true. But, when you're buying totally new equipment to deliver fish in San Francisco, and I guess there's some in New York, they do that too,
wow.
Groceries, and, we want the Postal Service to be the Postal Service and Peapod to be Peapod.
Well, but I've made the argument that even the concierge delivery to your house is beyond what, the mandate of the Postal Service is. And I, go back to Ben Franklin. I mean, just make sure the mail gets to my town and I can get to the post office and pick it up. Are we at a point where we've just grown so comfortable with the idea that for 50 cents I can get a letter pretty much anywhere I want delivered hand to hand to somebody?
Yeah, I think we're there. My relatives in Louisiana, they have a post office box. And, there's no mail delivery. They don't have a mailbox at their house at all.
Right.
So they just every day or so they go by and check the mail.
Mm-hmm.
But also the mail is less important to it. We get our bills online. We invite people to the party instead of sending them invitations. The nature of Christmas cards has changed from an envelope and a first-class mail to a postcard that's cheaper and easier to handle.
Oh, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly with that. But there are other things like, we often look at some of these cases like mail fraud, and you look at some of the biggest court cases and it's wire fraud and mail fraud. The U.S. Postal Service.
Lots of drugs shipped through the mail. Tons and tons of illegal drugs shipped through the mail.
Yeah. You see it all the time.
Because you've upped the package capacity so much. You have so many packages flowing through there, they can't inspect. And the easiest way, if you want to send cocaine or heroin or whatever to the United States, the easiest way to get it in now is through the Postal Service.
Is it because they're overwhelmed doing all this other stuff?
Absolutely. And that's another example of their deal-making skills is our postal rates for foreign mail. We pay much more to mail to anywhere else than people pay to mail here. We give everybody a big deal, and we are the biggest baddest postal service in the world.
So we charge less to send overseas mail than Britain or France would charge their citizens to send mail here?
Right. And like China, the deal it's unbelievably bad. The mismatch of the deal is unbelievably bad.
So, again, it sounds like one of these things where we need a deal maker coming in here. What is the end result? Does the federal government wind up federalizing the Postal Service? I think most Americans would, if you quizzed 100 Americans, 90 of them would say the Postal Service is a division of the government anyway. Or does the president just step in and say, I can help you get a better deal, whether he has any authority to or not?
I think this is a classic use of the bully pulpit, where the president can say, you have a you need to clean this up for public relations reasons. I'm going to keep bringing heat on you till you do. And Trump's pretty good about if they do it, he will come out and say, hey, they did it. They made the deal better. And he'll probably throw in, now he needs to fix his newspaper, but. I don't blame him for that.
That moment in the Rose Garden with Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump is going to be one of those. I expect to see Kim Jong-un in the Rose Garden before I see Jeff Bezos there.
That's about right.
Well, I appreciate it. What are you working on right now before we finish up with you? Brian McNicoll, columnist for Town Hall magazine online, townhall.com. What are you working on these days?
I have do stuff for Accuracy in Media, and we're writing about the census and the uproar over putting a citizenship question on the census. That's our biggest story for the day.
Well, and certainly one looks at the Constitution and the Declaration, and that whole part about drawing its just powers from the governed makes it seem like they intended there to be a citizenship compartment to our government.
Well, what do we use the census for, right? We use it to figure out how much of things we need, right? And, how many schools do we need to build and so forth. And if a lot of the programs are available only to citizens, and I think the reason the left doesn't like this is because it means that will get enforced a little more strictly.
Yeah, and they don't like the laws being enforced both directions. Brian, thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. God bless, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you all for listening as well. Again, visit us online at tertiumquids.org, podcasts of previous shows. And until next week, I'm Joe Thomas. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so long and thanks for all the fish.